This is Andrew Sullivan. He was born British, and he came over to America and became an American. But he has a little bit of British still in him. And so let's call him British American. And he came to America after graduating from Oxford to attend Harvard. I think he went to the Kennedy School first. Is that so? Yeah.
Yes, it is.
And then he switched over to the Department of Government, where he got his PhD with a dissertation on Michael Oakeshott, an English political theorist. So coming to Harvard is not the usual way to Americanize yourself, and perhaps not even to be recommended. But this is what he did. And so he wrote his dissertation, as I said, on this Englishman, Michael Oakeshott, who doesn't quite fit into the frame of the American founders, who were somewhat more theoretical than Oakeshott, who was a deliberate enemy of rationalism, or at least over-rationalism. So that's a problem. But somehow he overcame that. He he graduated, became editor of the New Republic at a young age, and he's written a number of books, of which I think the best, or perhaps the most prominent, is one called Virtually Normal, which is and virtually it's an argument, say, about homosexuality. That's the subtitle of it. And so I think this is, I would say, the book, or the best book on that subject that's available to us now in our time. And it was written from within, but it contains an argument, so it is directed to the outside. And the problem of it can be stated, or is stated succinctly in the title, Virtually Normal. What is the meaning of the word virtually? On the one hand, not normal, because it's only virtual. And on the other hand, almost normal, as it were normal. So that's sort of his self-presentation, and it's a wonderful book I recommend. And he began, I'm not sure he invented the blog, but he made it a regular instrument of communication in his, I think this is started in 2000, and he called it the Daily Dish. I would say that he is really the past master of bloggery, and he showed this over quite a long time. He then started writing for magazines, and most recently in July 2020, he resigned New York Magazine with, you might call it a splash or a cloud of dust, one of those two, or your Beth. Andrew is an enemy of political correctness, and this is perhaps his only point of agreement with Donald Trump. So Andrew, I've forgotten what are you going to talk on the election, or are you going to?
I am happy to talk about anything and to have a conversation. Can I thank you, first of all, for inviting me? It's a great honor. And thank you, too, for being the person who really introduced me to political philosophy in a quite wonderful way. I remember we spent 2 years reading The Republic together every Friday for an hour in the afternoon, and we really didn't finish it. But no one ever finishes reading The Republic, and I still haven't finished reading it, and I do dip into it from time to time. But to have been able to be taught by Harvey, as many people on this seminar will appreciate, is a huge privilege, and it's wonderful to be back and to see you. I thought I'd just start by saying why I think I am voting for Joe Biden, since we are talking about the election in the future. And some people have said to me, this is a strange position to take, given that your position on, for example, the assault on classical liberalism by the neo-Marxist left is a major cause for me. And I seem to be voting for someone who may usher some of this stuff into a forthcoming administration. And this is a terrible thing to do. And first of all, I want to say, yes, I am concerned that there will be people who will exploit Joe Biden in this respect. But secondly, I think that there has not been a better ally for wokeness, if you want to say, than the polarization of Donald J. Trump. I don't think he invented political correctness, but he definitely, obviously he didn't. And I'm not saying that the excesses of this ideology weren't apparent before Trump. I am saying that he, as president, has done nothing but intensify its countercultural power and has presided over its takeover of much of the elite. And that however much we have to and want to, I want to, expose and with any luck defang this ideology, Trump is a problem for that, not an asset. And then I also hold to quite traditional views of how a president should conduct himself, which Donald J. Trump has, I think everyone can agree, flouted at every conceivable opportunity. I believe in a president who reveres the rule of law and is the most important defender of it, not someone who has clearly broken the law, pushed against democratic norms and liberal principles, refused to be accountable to the Congress, used the power of the purse and the presidential emergency declarations to seize power from Congress, who has refused to submit any subpoenas to the Congress, who has invented national emergencies to do what he wants, and is generally and clearly hostile to the principles, the give and take, and the moderation that is essential for the proper functioning of a liberal democracy. And that is my core worry about him, that he represents a real violation of what I would consider traditional conservative values and traditional conservative temperament and behavior in the presidency. And in fact, Joe Biden and Barack Obama much better represent that moderate tradition of presidential leadership. The last point is simply, we are in the middle of a public health crisis, and that is a legitimate question for debate. I do think that the epidemic is a very hard thing to govern, and I think many governments across the world have grappled with it and failed and succeeded in some parts, but it's a mess and it's hard, and it requires consistency and doggedness and patience and clarity and transparency. And I think when you look at Trump's record on this, it has been quite appalling from the very beginning. And it shows a man really dedicated to more thriving in a talk radio context than actually governing a country or reaching compromises or moving things forward in a way that all Americans can, at least in part, support. And that's why I'm supporting Biden, even though I have obvious qualms. No choice in politics is clear. I'm a terrible foe of this notion of binary decisions in politics. There are so many factors to be considered always in making a political decision. So I feel quite confident that Biden is the lesser evil in this context. And I worry about the stability of the republic, the sustaining of democratic norms, and indeed civil peace in this country if this person is reelected for 4 more years. And I thought it'd be obvious, since we're talking the day after the last presidential debate, thank God, that we might start with that subject. But I really want to be able to engage the rest of you in a conversation about this. A conversation, Michael Oakeshott, the man I studied, had a lovely view of conversation. And he compared it with debate in a way. Debate is like a tennis match in which you're trying to win every point. It's important to beat your opponent and to score down the line victories. A conversation is like a friendly game. Even though you may be about to win, you want to keep the game going. You want to give your partner a little bit of a leeway. You want to let him hit back a ball that goes off outside the line occasionally. Because the point is the to and fro, the reasonable discourse, the engagement with one another as equals in a society based on reason. And so that's the spirit with which I enter this conversation.
There we go.
All right. Maybe people could start raising their hands because we're ready to take questions. But let me give one. Let me start with one. And on your first point, wokeness. It does seem a bit paradoxical, if not actually perverse, to blame Trump for wokeness or the rise of wokeness or the power of wokeness, when he seems still to be the unique politician in America to denounce it. And why don't the others join in? Where to get any of that from, especially from a Democrat?
I agree, Harvey. It's important to note that he hasn't really talked about this until.
Oops. Is this Andrew or is this on our side?
I think it's Andrew.
Yeah, we can't see him either.
Harvey, do you want to?
As an experiment, would it help if all of us shut off our video, except Andrew, to see whether that's what the problem is?
Okay, good. Thank you, Jennifer.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Until quite recently, when he was
No,
I think it is him.
doesn't seem to be working.
Yeah. So this is a new situation for us. What do we do?
Vamp.
Your second talk, and the first one worked perfectly.
Do you want to send Andrew a message? Just make sure he knows we're out of touch with him.
Yeah. I think I only have his email, so I'll send him an email.
He's talking. He's muted. That's the problem.
He's muted.
Hi there. Hello.
No, he's not muted.
He's now back. He was for a minute.
Back. Can you see me, Anna?
Andrew, talk again, Andrew. You were gone for this whole time.
I know. I don't know what happened. It just blacked out, I'm afraid. Can you hear me now and see me now?
Yes, fine.
I apologize. I don't know what happened. Sometimes these things blurp.
Don't worry.
They do.
You're right. There is an incredible social pressure on people not to say the obvious, which is that this stuff is poisonous, that it's actually racist, that its premises are fundamentally illiberal. And the reason it has this command, I think, is that everybody is understandably terrified of being called a racist or a sexist or a bigot or all the other things that you're allegedly hostile to, as opposed to someone who just believes in the liberal project, broadly understood. And I'm very dismayed by this. I don't think Trump has been a leader in focusing on this problem. I'm worried that Biden is way too soft and naive about it. I do think, however, that the pushback against this can't only come from the partisan right. It has to come from the liberal center as well. And I think we've begun to see a dogged group of writers and thinkers attempting to reclaim classical liberalism and indeed just liberal democracy from these fanatics and ideologues of the far left. And I don't blame Trump for it. I think, in fact, some of it created Trump, actually prompted people to vote for someone who would seem to be a completely anathema to these people in a profound way. But I do think there is a much better way of countering it that does not bring up all the almost caricature of the quote unquote patriarchal white racist bigot that Trump represents to a large number of people, and therefore actually kind of discredits the cause that we're trying to advance. I don't think Donald Trump is a vehicle for the return of a proper liberal democracy. I just don't. I think he is, in fact, a kind of illiberalism of the right, a personal cult that I find deeply concerning when it comes to the maintenance of a liberal society.
All right, Paul Peterson, you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
So Andrew, I find your reasoning very persuasive. I can't decide what to do in this election because, as you point out, there is a powerful case on both sides here. But I do think you have to, well, I'd like to see how you respond to this. On the one, Trump raised issues that were not being addressed by the political elites who preceded him or within the Republican Party, who were going to emerge as the leaders of that party. The serious grievances of ordinary Americans who were suffering from the internationalization of the manufacturing sector and the job losses that were happening in middle America, and the perceived threat of ethnic groups coming across the border illegally that seemed to be, nobody cared about that this was happening and nobody was willing to do anything about it. And he sort of dramatized those grievances. And of course, it takes an unusual personality to challenge the consensus of the elites of a society. And of course, he's ridiculously over the top and has done all kinds of, I would say, has built on the constitutional dismantling of his predecessors. I think his predecessors began to assume power into the executive branch steadily over time. And he built on that. I don't think he's brand new. I don't think it's going to go away. I think we're going to continue to see it. In fact, we are hearing in the course of this campaign suggestions of court packing, returning, of changing the election rules in fundamental ways. So, the challenges to the constitutional order are not coming just from one direction. And maybe the more serious ones are coming not from Trump, but from those opposed to him. And shouldn't they be penalized? Shouldn't they be penalized for doing this? They could win this election by being moderate. Now, you can say, well, Biden wouldn't do this. But I mean, he doesn't seem like a strong enough leader. He seems like a fragile person. And you have to sort of assume that he is not going to be the leader of the new administration. Somebody else is going to be. We don't quite know who it will be, whether it will be the vice president or whether it will be somebody else. But it's hard to believe that that Biden is going to be strong enough to hold off the very forces that you say you are the most concerned about. So I recognize the validity of all your points. There's no question about that. But I do think you have to look at the other side of the coin a little bit more carefully than you have thus far.
excuse me. I take your point. I see where you're coming from. The key thing I would argue that might make you feel a little bit more comfortable is that I think if Biden wins, he's going to bring in a large number of Democrats into the Congress and the Senate who are actually from more moderate districts. If he wins big, he's going to be winning in places which are going to bring moderate Democrats into the fold. I would also point out that in the actual Democratic primary election, Biden was not regarded as in any way viable by large numbers of the pundit and political class who were often on Twitter and were often caught up in the elite woke discourse. They dismissed him. But actually, average Democrats who have not yet been completely brainwashed by wokeness, and critically Black Democrats who also are less extreme on these racial issues than rich white liberals, also supported Biden. There is, I think, a silent majority among Democrats that is not that comfortable with these kinds of issues and does not want massive social re-engineering on racial grounds and does not want the kind of squelching of open discourse that we are seeing. I would also argue that although I'm concerned about these issues, they are not the only ones. We do have, it seems to me, to address questions like climate change, which are incredibly dangerous and are clearly, as time goes by, the threat seems to be greater, not lesser. And this man has absolute hostility to any arguments or programs to mitigate the damage. And also, I think what he has done to our political culture is to vulgarize it in such a way as to make a sensible left harder and harder to find and a sensible right harder and harder to sustain. That when you have a person who's created essentially a personality cult within a political party and taken over that political party, essentially, then it is the job of people who believe in moderation and liberal democracy to make sure that that particular act is punished. We can draw a line under it. And then we fight another battle when Biden, and if Biden becomes president. You know, I followed Biden many years. He's undergone all sorts of shifts and changes over the years. He's much, much less irritating than he used to be. Seems much less likely to have a case of logorrhea and be unable to shut up. And this reinvention of him as this kindly old man who's decent is a brilliant reinvention. And I think, frankly, it's what the country desperately needs culturally. We need to lower the temperature. We need to get past this very online, emotive, algorithm-driven, visceral Twitter discourse. You can say that Trump was in some ways a response to wokeness, but he is the ultimate online president. He is the master of Twitter, which has, I think, rendered our discourse incredibly base and superficial. He's clearly incapable of understanding a distinction between fact and fiction. He's psychologically clearly delusional and personally malevolent. I've struggled as a Christian to understand and to find something in Donald Trump that I'm supposed to love and forgive. And I have to say, I have yet to find a single redeeming characteristic that I could conceivably attach any sort of compassion for. This is an extraordinary person. And that this person represents us, that this awful human being represents the United States, the world, it is a part of America, the worst, ugliest, foulest part of America that has been in the White House the last 4 years. But I desperately believe for our civil cohesion and indeed the possibility of a civil discourse, he must be removed. And the sooner the better.
Okay, Lorraine Pangle. Please unmute yourself.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm a professor at the University of Texas at Austin, and I have been enjoying reading your writings for a long time.
Thank you.
And I think I agree with everything you just said. I also am a conservative Biden voter this time for reasons you've been talking about. And you've mentioned Trump's lack of conservative values and his temperament and his behavior. I wonder if the problem that we're facing needs to be framed maybe more directly as a problem of character. It strikes me that people are not talking about character very much. We may have forgotten how to talk about character. For a long time in our lifetimes, the reigning ethos in our country has been relativism. You shouldn't judge anybody else's character or lifestyle or any other culture. And I think we've entered a post-relativistic period. I wonder what you think about this, where we all, again, passionately care about right and wrong and good and bad, more passionately than we have for a long time, but we don't know how to talk about it. We don't know how to think about it with any nuance. And so we have people reduced to spluttering about Donald Trump's terrible personality, but his personality isn't really the issue. It's character. And I'm wondering, did our founders understand the importance of that enough? Were they trusting too much in institutions to give us good governance? And are we discovering now that the institutions only work if there are people with good character to uphold them and to keep them? And is that maybe the most important thing we should be thinking about in putting somebody in office? What do you think?
That's wonderfully put. And I think it's that distinction between personality and character is crucial, because personality is really an asset for an entertainer. It's an asset for a performance artist, which you enjoy watching as a kind of form of diversion and distraction. A reality television mindset that this man has. But what's staggering about him is he seems to have no other mindset, no other capacity to see himself other than this constant triumph of his delusional will. I think of Harvey's book about manliness too. I think of the notion of the responsible statesman proving his manliness by his restraint, by his measured response to things, by his ability to weigh arguments and to make prudent decisions. This man is completely lacking in that capacity. He's also completely lacking in what I would call a very simple term, which is responsibility. He was like this throughout his life, subjecting children to his own stories leaked to the tabloids about his own affairs with other women. The abuse of women, which is extraordinary. The contempt for people that he has displayed. These are distortions and a debauched understanding of what being a man really is. The failure to restrain any of his appetites. He is, and I refer back to the Republic, Plato. If you look at the character, the psyche of the tyrant as explained in the Republic, this inability to contain appetite, this constant frenzy in your mind in which there is never any stillness or reflection or contemplation, the absence of any sense of responsibility for the future, only about your own future. These are terrible. I think the founders fully understood that without a virtuous citizenry capable of electing a virtuous person, we're not talking about saints, we're talking about people able to uphold civic virtue, respect for the law, defense of the Constitution, civility towards your opponents, the use of language that ennobles and doesn't debase. I think they were fully aware, but I think they were also aware that democracies and republics become democracies, and democracies love vulgarity. I mean, it's the demos and the vulgar together. And what we saw, I think, was, and again, returning to the previous question, we did see people elect this clown in the full awareness, I think, of many of them that he is and was a clown and an awful human being. And so the lesson about Trump, in my mind, is that character is critically important, that democracies tend to devalue character because it implies hierarchy and authority in ways that democracies tend to be impatient with or hostile to. This cult of egalitarianism makes the cultivation of virtue seem like an aristocratic or in some ways snooty endeavor. And that what made his election possible, even though his own personal characteristics were and are so repellent, was that the elites, by which I include myself, had ignored critical things that were happening in the country that absolutely required addressing, and that he did address them in the worst and foulest way, but in a way that was essential and in a way that I fear the elites have still not understood. A president is fundamentally responsible to his own citizens first. That borders need to be enforced if a republic or if a political entity is to have any coherence and cohesion. The smartest thing he ever said, you don't have borders, you don't have a nation. I think he rightly understood that the scale and pace of mass immigration from very different cultures to society in the last couple of decades, which has led the United States to the highest proportion of foreign-born people in the country since for at least a century. And that we have to be able to debate and have as a clear political question, the question of the level of immigration. This is not an immoral thing to talk about. It is not bigoted to talk about restraining immigration. It's not bigoted to talk about maintaining the cultural cohesion and unity of a country when it is being confronted with massive and unprecedented demographic change, as well as social change and economic change. The elites, because we've been ensconced in a rather prosperous bubble, didn't see this. The way in which the country has divided meant that we were in many ways blind to it. And I found it in my own, I came to terms with it more with my own family, who were not American, but they're British, but they were Brexit supporters. And they're good people. They didn't go to college either. I come from relatively modest background. I could see what they were saying. We think the change in our country is really too fast. I don't recognize the place I live in. I feel like I'm being attacked for just saying things that I believe are common sense. And I don't mean ill will to people. And when Hillary Clinton told them that they were deplorable and should be cut out of the entire political debate, I think that was a sign to them that even if they have to vote for Trump, they'll vote for something other than this. I think the legacy of the failure in Iraq and the Republican Party's refusal to really own up to it clearly, and people like Jeb Bush in the 2016 primary campaign still extolling his brother's record in that area. Again, Trump succeeded not just because he was a charlatan and a vulgar and obnoxious bigot, I think all of which he is, but because he tapped into ideas and arguments that the liberal elites refused to look at, or treated as anathema, treated as somehow untouchable. And I fear, if you look at the debate on immigration last night in the debate, for example, Biden and the Democrats have not betrayed the slightest qualm about mass immigration and effectively open borders, and are actually campaigning on expanding immigration. And if the amnesty that he promises will take place within 180 days of his winning, we will see almost certainly another wave of mass immigration coming up from the South. This destabilizes our country. It actually strengthens white nationalism. A prudent conservatism is concerned about the cultural, cohesion and stability of the country as it is. And it is not shameful to say, and I say this as an immigrant, even though I'm now a citizen, it's not shameful to say that that distinction matters. Interestingly, in the Republic itself, Plato describes democracies as a place where the roles of men and women become utterly interchangeable, where students teach their teachers and tell them what to do, and where the distinction between a foreigner and a citizen is regarded as anathema. This is in Plato. This is what democracies do. And my worry is that there are two options from that democratic egalitarianism. One is what Plato understood to be tyranny, which is the shift from that kind of radical end stage democracy to a kind of tyrannical solution in which a demagogue exploits the masses and takes power. Or one would hope, if one doesn't share the ancients' sense of inevitability about this, that we could sustain liberal democracy by fighting against the trends that democracies have, by persuasively attempting to encourage a bigger middle class and a greater civility and greater emphasis on the virtues of moderation and restraint and toleration. So yes, character obviously matters, and I'm not a morally judgmental person. I'm a terrible sinner. I have lots of flaws. I don't want to sit in judgment. I even defended Bill Clinton from impeachment, even though I think he was a squalid person. But Trump is just a disgusting person. I mean, honestly, I've never met anybody. I've come across anybody in public life as repellent as this person. From the hideous vanity, to the unbelievable vulgarity, to the pathological narcissism, and the utter self-centeredness that is truly a wonder to behold, a one-off. But he is absolutely what Plato described as a tyrannical psyche, and is incapable of moderation, incapable of change, incapable of listening to others, and unstoppable. And we deserve better. We absolutely deserve better in a civilized country.
Okay, Rita, this will be a hard one to top, but go for it.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up sort of on what Paul had asked. So I agree with you that if Biden is elected, he's going to be put into office largely by a more moderate constituency than the very online. But I guess my question is about who then goes into his administration, because it doesn't seem to me that there's a very clear flow between the moderate constituency and the kinds of people who end up in presidential administrations, and there hasn't been for a long time. And so how do you see that translating the sort of, what you say is a more centrist or liberal center electorate, and the elite that ends up in presidential administrations, which tends to be much more like the very online crowd than the Ken Bone or Joe the plumber, town hall questioning crowd?
Well, I think temperamentally, Biden is not really comfortable with those people very much. I think he's temperamentally more comfortable with working class people in Pennsylvania. I think he's old fashioned in some important ways. And I worry that, especially on these critical race theory for one question, but also things like his support for the Equality Act, which essentially abolishes the category of sex in civil rights law and replaces it or subsumes it under this nebulous concept of gender, which is, I think, a deeply subversive and fraudulent view of the world. I think he does, for example, on that and on race itself, I think he does it out of a rather, I mean, if I were to say this in as positive a way, because he has a big heart and he feels for people who feel discriminated against or marginalized. And I think that's to his credit. But I also think he's not that intellectually rigorous or smart enough to understand what the agenda of some of these people really is. I tend to think that on questions like that, I don't think he's going to be a big supporter of defunding the cops. I don't think he's going to be a real radical on law and order issues. I do think the administration is going to be focused actually more and more on economics, that we're going to have this huge new stimulus, which is going to be oriented around green infrastructure. We're going to have a shift clearly. David Brooks says today smartly that on economic issues, I think there's a general feeling that in fact, we do need a correction from the laissez-faire policies of the last several years, and indeed the last generation. And as someone who supported those policies, I can see that they have become in many ways a victim of their own success, and that some of this laissez-faire capitalism has begun, as conservatives always understood it would, to undermine very basic social fabric. And that requires reconstituting. So I guess what I'm telling you is that I agree. It concerns me very much. I don't think it's, and it's always, it's always these second tier people. It's the administrators in colleges that are the real red guard, as it were. It's often not even the students until they are intimidated into believing this claptrap. But yes, we may have to endure some of this, but at least it will be then out in the open. We can tackle it. We can keep pressure on Biden not to abandon the coalition that he assembled in favor for a narrower, more radical one. We can try and create media outlets and a discourse that is neither crazy propaganda, right-wing, delusional, paranoid, conspiratorial palooza, which is what we have, in favor of better liberal media. But again, the thing about these people is it only takes a few really to hound and persecute and intimidate the rest. Quite a few people have now essentially taken over, for example, the New York Times, which reads every day like a critical theory academic journal that people are passing around in the faculty lounge. So that's all I can say. I don't disagree with you. I think it's going to be rough. I think getting rid of this guy is the beginning and not the end of the fight back for liberal, and I mean old school liberal values.
All right, Jim Hankins, please.
Yeah. Thank you. I wanted to ask you about foreign policy, just to change the subject up a bit. I used to think that the most important factor in voting for a president was his views on foreign policy, because he has the most power there, his most untrammeled ability to set policy in foreign affairs. And also, I'm really astonished by the control of trade that the president has. It's been dramatized by Trump. He's always slapping tariffs. Tariffs, for some reason, are always slapped. I don't know why. You can't just have a tariff. You have to slap a tariff. Anyway, but he's been slapping tariffs and unslapping tariffs. So my question is about what you think of China policy in particular, because I think most people now realize that our number one competitor, rival internationally is China, and China is not taking any prisoners, or they are taking prisoners, but they're not. China is actually quite determined to displace us in the world order. There have been a number of books about this recently. Perhaps you've seen them. A very good one by, I just reviewed it, but I can't remember the name of the author, Michael Alslin, if you saw that book. So we have a major challenge coming. It's already there. And I have some worries about Biden on that score, since quite recently he has been saying that China is no threat whatsoever, that they're nice people, and that we can deal with them. Maybe one should be careful, because pretty much everybody was saying that up to about 2015. And then suddenly when Xi Jinping started showing his teeth and becoming much more of a legalist, as they say in China, much more of a Machiavellian, and using the full power of the state in economics and technology and military affairs to press Chinese influence. Then suddenly in the last 4 years, 5 years, people have woken up to the challenge of China, and they've realized that there's a new Cold War going on. You know, Neil Ferguson used to talk about Chimerica, right? The combination of China and America being one economic body, and which are feeding on the other. And we had done this marvelous thing with China of bringing a third of the Chinese people out of poverty. And now Neil Ferguson, the same Neil Ferguson, is talking about Cold War II with the Chinese. So I'm a little worried about Biden because I haven't heard him make any serious policy statements about what the US should do about the challenge of China. There's some old quotes of his that are recycled when he talks about, working with China and having a normal relationship with them. I assume that his foreign policy team will be Obama retreads of one kind or another. But I wonder if do you have any read on what Biden thinks we should do about China?
Well, I think there have been a couple of developments, as you point out. The gamble that many of us agreed to make in the 1990s and turn of the century, that prosperity will lead to democracy within China, has turned out to be a fool's idea. That in fact, we are actually confronting not just another great power, but an ideological battle, which has been highlighted with COVID-19 and the epidemic. Does liberal democracy beat Confucian totalitarianism, as it were? Does the role of the state in directing both economic activity and also in mastering surveillance through the media of its citizens a model for the rest of the world to follow? And I think for many dictators, it is. Mm. You've also had the notion of China clearly attempting to use its clout to affect the United States culturally. The way in which Hollywood has capitulated to a communist dictatorship in filtering the content of its own films and movies and products, for example, is really staggering, and it's much more widespread than you would imagine. You know, we have the worry in wokeness of sensitivity readers for books coming out. My own last column used to have to go through what I called a woke check, where various members of beleaguered, marginalized minorities would check the column to make sure it didn't hurt anybody's feelings unnecessarily, with the keyword being unnecessarily. But we have a sensitivity reader for a lot of American culture, which is in Beijing, which refuses to allow real criticism. We have another question, another issue which has emerged, which is that China is a clearly genocidal country at this point, that its treatment of its Uyghur minorities is absolutely horrifying and puts them and should put them in a completely different category in terms of our foreign relations. And I think that is understood within the Biden camp. The liberal internationalists that we may see coming into them may be getting a little bit more hawkish about China because of its clearly genocidal intent. I don't think China is another Soviet Union, because I don't think state-run capitalism is as dangerous as communism. But I think the battle between free democracies forging their own future from the bottom up, as opposed to unelected dictatorships using power to improve the standards of living of lots of people, but at the price of their political freedoms, is a real battle that we can wage. Now, look, Trump believes in the Chinese model, not the American. He actually, we now know, told President Xi to keep his policy of genocide against the Uyghurs. he loves intuitively
For that?
dictatorships. Say what?
What's the evidence for that? Sorry. You're not going to tell me the New York Times, I hope.
It was leaked in I think it was in Bob Woodward's book.
Oh,
That he told Xi to sort of keep going.
well,
Don't worry, we will make no worries about persecuting Muslims because after all, we kind of are on your side in this. Trump's celebration of dictatorships is unique in the history of America. Unique. No one ever said these people were great before, or that that's the way to go, or that when Xi pronounced himself president for life, actually said that would be a good idea here too. I mean, what Trump has done with respect to the reputation of democracy and the foulness of authoritarianism is extraordinary. Now, do I think Biden is going to be a sap for China? I don't. Do I think that in the struggle for defending liberal democracy against this kind of dirigiste totalitarianism, I think Biden is infinitely preferable. And I think also with you that this haphazard slapping of this tariff, that tariff, this constant gamesmanship with China that doesn't seem to have led anywhere in particular has not been very fruitful. And look at how the terms have changed though. Biden is not campaigning for freer trade. He's not campaigning for the TPP. He is campaigning for more factories to be brought home. He is campaigning for labor in trade disputes. He is no longer the NAFTA candidate. He has moved back, and I think so. I think he's done so more credibly than some others in the Democratic Party might have been able to. So that's my sense. And I also think the ability for the West and for democratic nations to unite and present a common front against both Islamic terrorism and also Chinese autocracy is important. And I think Trump has done immense damage to the common values of Europeans, Americans, and the Anglosphere in general against the depredations of people like Putin and Xi. Not that I want to go back to neoconservatism, no, but I don't think we're going to be engaging in, I hope to God, another Libya war, or yet let alone another Iraq war. And I do think that Obama was more successful in restraining Iran than Trump has been.
Okay, Shep. Melnick, please.
Hi, Andrew. I want to start off by saying how much I appreciate your essays. I thought that your essay on Trump and Richard III was really brilliant, as was your your last one on the causes of wokeness. So I guess my question is about that we've been talking about the way in which a Biden administration might exacerbate the problem, but government support for wokeness, I think, pales in comparison with academic support. And you've given some reasons why this kind of very abstract theory has gotten so much purchase within academia and within corporate. So I wonder if you could say something about what you think those of us who are concerned about this can do where we live, which is most of us in academia.
Fight back. Be more. There are so. I mean, if I could show you the private communications I get from academics supporting the positions I'm taking and the analysis that I'm giving, but not publicly saying so for fear of their jobs. I think if you've got tenure and you do not speak out against this, you are part of the problem, not part of the solution. It does, it's the cowardice of liberals that will consign us to the far left. And only liberals can really do that. Center-left people have got to take the struggle. It's not enough for people on the right to do this. And I agree with you. I don't see the federal government actually, even though it has some of these hideous training materials, is the real source of it. This is a bottom-up, social, cultural, media-driven, elite-driven ideological transformation. And there are two errors, I think, in greeting it. The first is saying, this is just a few crazy academics and a few easily misled youngsters, and people have always been like, this is the main theme coming from the center left. Don't worry about it, or you're just a crackpot. No, this is not true. So many corporations now have this embedded in their hiring and firing practices. We're seeing attacks upon the SATs to create colleges as entirely functions of racial and social engineering as opposed to this pursuit of knowledge. We've seen polls that show that people are terrified of speaking their mind on certain questions. That is going up increasingly among liberals as well as conservatives. We see cancel culture, which has been this grotesque pillorying of any independent thought. I mean, look, I mean, I'm not going to use myself particularly as an example, but I can tell you that if you were in the mainstream media and just simply refusing to go along with this sudden transformation in people's cultural outlook, you were not just suspect, you were targeted for unbelievable harassment, abuse, criticism, and pressure within these institutions and from outside of them, with social media being this incredibly awful mob baying for blood and saying and spreading the worst untruths and distortions about you. I mean, honestly, I am not a stranger to controversy, as you may know, over the years. To some extent, I relish it because I think it sometimes helps get to the core of issues. You can actually get to the nub of things when you actually get a good, strong debate going. But I have never experienced this kind of hideous, personal, ad hominem, moral indictments. I have never seen standards in journalism decline to the level of Nicole Hannah-Jones as some kind of serious critic of the culture. I don't think we've ever seen a situation in which an unbelievably third-rate book by a third-rate mind, this person, Ibram X. Kendi, is actually mandated for regular human beings to read just to go back into the office the next day, because they have to come to terms with their own white fragility and internalization of white supremacy. All this stuff is, I believe we've got to keep all the time pushing back on it, all the time also creating and defending a vision of real diversity, of the uniqueness of individuals, of the massive and wonderful complexity of American society and of American individuals. And remind people of how great that is to overcome these boundaries. I mean, it was so exhausting to be constantly called the gay Catholic writer. It's like, can you just call me a writer? I mean, yeah, I'm okay with these labels because, you know, you can put them on me. But the idea this is going to tell you what's interesting about me is fallacious and condescending and wrong. I also think, by the way, that the constant depiction of the African-American experience as this unbelievably powerless, marginalized, helpless, and part of American culture as an immigrant to America could not be further from the truth. This country is suffused with the power of African-American culture. It would only be America if that were the case. This is what makes it so different from Europe. Maybe it takes a European to see this. But the way in which African-Americans and their contribution in the past and the present are being turned into this pathetic crew of utter victims is just bewildering to me and not true about the world. It's a hard line to tread because you also, everyone is aware that racism still exists. I'm constantly aware that hostility to gay people still exists, but I am also struck, for example, by the astonishing, I mean, Harvey talked about my book, Virtue Normal. That was 1995. 25 years later, I am living in a transformed world. Try telling me that America is impossibly hostile to minorities or to No, America is not. It is not inherently more racist than anywhere else. I think it's inherently less racist. I think we have to point to increasingly the success of a multicultural, multiracial democracy in this country by understanding the difficulty of it, by understanding better that this has never been tried before. It's hard. It's amazing that we're doing as well as we are, and that focusing on our divisions is such a terrible way to conduct our politics, and telling people and minorities that they are defined by and victimized by parts of their identity, as opposed to being empowered and made flourishing through these aspects of their lives that only really come to power with the individual. This is what we have to say. It's a winning message. It was a message that most Americans understood intuitively. It's a message that Barack Obama, as recently as his own presidency, was saying. And I think pointing out, but again, I think Obama needs to be tougher on this. And the people that Obama, who is not, for example, an advocate of identity politics and did not run like that, he has occasionally obliquely criticized the woke as self-indulgent and too disparaging of the possibilities of America. But again, he needs to grow some and get out there. And maybe my hope is that once the phantasm of Trump is removed, so that all of those of us who are criticizing BLM, who are criticizing critical race theory, who are criticizing critical gender and queer theory, are not put in a context where we are somehow defending this man, when we are actually supporting, and again, within the Republican Party and within conservatism, that we should be championing individualism, which may reflect and will reflect our cultural and racial and demographic diversity. This is the case to be made, and I'm excited about it, to be honest, because I think once we get this pinata, this distracting, this obsessive, this awful, constant presence in our psyches, this man, we will, and therefore inevitably side with those who oppose him, or at least have more sympathy with those people. We can begin to grapple with this battle within liberalism. It's also true that resisting the degradation of conservatism to white identity politics, to a backward-looking and slightly, I mean, at best, slightly bigoted, worse, and the worst, horribly bigoted identity politics of the right. That's a task for those of us who are on the center right as well, to say, no, conservatism cannot be a personality cult. It's the antithesis of conservatism. It cannot be authoritarian, I'm sorry. It must be inclusive and forward-looking. The younger generation have just not heard that case. And I think getting rid of Trump is the sine qua non of remaking it and explaining it and exciting people about it again. I mean, maybe immigrants can do this because we know what's great about this country. That's why we come here. And some of us don't want to see it transformed massively overnight. And many of us have sympathy for those who are unnerved by these shifts and changes. Sorry, I'm going on too long, but it's such a fruitful, I get worked up about this. I can't tell you how maddening it gets to me to listen to this crap all the time. I can't get
more questions
times without my blood pressure going through the roof. And I just, but I realize I also have to calm down and make these arguments as clearly as I can and as positively as I can. But the fact that otherwise decent liberals in a liberal magazine like New York could not tolerate just a columnist having an alternative point of view is a really worrying situation. Or that they will rather throw out talent for mediocrities in order to retain the monopoly of this ideology over our culture. It can be fought back. It will be fought. We will fight back against it. And I think we'll win in the end.
But in the meantime, you might be explaining why Trump got elected. Okay, Lior, next.
Okay, can you see me? Okay.
Yes.
Andrew, thank you so much. I second Shep in saying that your essays, and I would add podcasts, are just extremely enlightening and always fun and entertaining to read and listen to. Maybe to summarize what you were saying to Shep, when it comes to anti-wokeness, silence is violence. What I want to ask you a philosophical question about wokeness, but before, maybe just a very brief comment, which is just in response to your previous answer. I was struck that you said that the solution to this has to come from bottom up. You seem to give short shrift to kind of top-down solutions. And it seems to me that there is nobody but Trump, and here I kind of go back to something that maybe Harvey was saying earlier, who is willing to put any kind of political force behind anti-wokeness. And I have in mind, you know, Trump's recent executive orders on no critical race theory in federal agencies. His administration's pushback against anti-Semitism on campus through its interpretation of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. I mean, these are not inconsequential measures, and I just don't see any other politician willing to stick their neck out like that. And I wonder if it's just because of Trump doesn't care about what people think of him that he's able and willing to do that. But to get to my question, I guess the big question here is, to what extent should we try to push back against wokeness? And the reason I raise that is because I wonder if wokeness has its own natural limitations. I wonder if the extent to which wokeness is allowed to flourish, as it were, it starts to eat itself away and expose its own ridiculousness. So, you know, as a student of political philosophy, I'm sure you're aware that, you know, the early thinkers of the Enlightenment were doing battle with religion. And, you know, a key strategy of writers like Hobbes and Montesquieu was to poke fun, was to ridicule. Ridicule turns out to be an extremely effective method of argumentation. And I raise that because, you know, I've been teaching for the past couple of years at a prestigious liberal arts college here on the East Coast that is well known for being very far on the left. And, you know, last year we got I think it was the context was Transgender Awareness Month or something like that. And we got from the administration, from the Office of Student Affairs, we got a link to a website where we could kind of peruse the various pronouns that students might have, and that the administration said we had an obligation to ask students what pronouns they want. And I remember going to this website, and it was divided into categories, including categories of animals for people who identify as various animals. One of them, I remember telling my wife, being a worm. So if you identify as a worm, your pronouns are worm self. And I remember reading this and thinking, there's no way this could possibly be real. There's no way anybody who takes themselves seriously could send this to professors. But there we have it, right? There you have it. So, you know, that's one example of how, especially in a context of a college, a campus that's very far left, where everybody more or less thinks the same thing, you know, wokeness kind of works itself into absurdity in a way that exposes its own ridiculousness and kind of undercuts its own intellectual authority. I hope that that's what happened here. One more example is, and by the way, I would point out, maybe this is also kind of in relation to Shep's question. In academia, I think there are not only are there not incentives for being anti-woke, but there are structural material incentives for being woke, especially because it allows you to publish, especially because, as we recently learned with this hoax that came out last year, that, you know, this is kind of an emperor has a no clothes situation, where if I don't say anything and you don't say anything, we'll agree to not say anything, and we'll all be able to publish in the feminist journal of geography, right? And get tenure. I don't think that those incentives exist outside of academia. But just to give the second example, I live in a town south of Boston, a very liberal town, and recently the school district, the school board has decided to eliminate AP statistics. And by the way, this is a town that people move to because of the quality of its public schools, right? They pay a lot of money to live here. And the school district decided to eliminate AP statistics on the grounds that there were not enough African-American students in it, right? That was their solution, because equality means equalizing down, right? And this has generated outrage among people in the community, even people who are, consider themselves on the left, on the progressive left, because now it's harming them and their own kids, and they're paying money that they don't get a good service for. So again, I wonder if there's something within the logic of PC, its search for purity, its disincentives for people who consider themselves woke to criticize it. I wonder if there's something that people like us should just let it run its course rather than try to push back, as Trump has done, and create a new adversary that the woke crowd can rally against. Thank you.
I think all those are great points. We've seen humor. I mean, you think of those papers, the hoax papers put out by James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose and Peter Boghossian, where they're talking about the sex lives of the rape in the dog park. And I mean, seriously, hilarious. I mean, it's amazing that these people can recover from that kind of exposure. Similarly, when elementary kids are being told that boys have periods and that girls have penises, there comes a point at which people are like, what? And teachers, I mean, parents of kids that are being put through these indoctrination programs are beginning to resist. Making fun of these people is actually important. And pointing out the absurdities. I mean, the African American Museum's a big poster about whiteness equals showing up on time and turning in your homework. I mean, the way in which there is bigotry embedded in the way in which people's response to the failure of African American students, for example, to do as well as others, is to just simply lower the standards, not actually ask. And that's what you're also seeing, the collapse and the abandonment of SATs around the country, and any kind of objective testing that could give us a sense of reality, because you have to create this false reality. The problem is, I think, with all these, and this is why I watch South Park all the time, because it's just the most brilliant skewering of this stuff in a way that's cool and fun. And I don't know why, to be honest, this obvious silliness of some of this stuff and the preciousness of it and the absurdity of it hasn't engendered yet a kind of response, a mocking response from a younger generation that just wants to, as usual, be a subversive of their authorities. Why have they all classed onto it? I mean, and why this summer did we see this sort of mass hysteria that required us people to say things that are clearly, they have no idea what they're talking about, and they're clearly just emotive elements. I mean, again, I think the emergence of Trump and the far right as in the culture has rendered that space smaller to make, because it seems like you are ridiculing those seeking justice and humanity and thereby defending people like Trump, and so it loses some of its edge. So maybe we might see some more humor and subversion of it in the future. But I also think you could make the argument, for example, that if you take wokeness to its ultimate conclusion, which is that you're only a function of these various identities, these group identities, well, we're all complicated. There should be a million different identities that we have, or ways in which we can be described. If you get all of them into a person, intersectionality in the end could mean 1,000 different aspects of your identity, which in the end ends up as just individuality. But for some reason, it hasn't worked yet, has it? I mean, do you see your kids, your students, like giggling at some of the stupidity of this? I wish I did, and I wonder whether that's related to some extent to the way in which these kids have been brought up from the get-go, which is the worst thing in the world, is to feel uncomfortable or to have some sort of dissonance in your life, that everything has to be completely coherent and safe, and you can't offend anybody. I think we will increasingly see reactions to this. I just fear that that it's gone so far, it's going to be a very hard time getting out of this tunnel. But I'm with you. I do think that's another strategy. But look at someone like James Lindsay, who's doing really great work in exposing the intellectual and philosophical roots of wokeness more clearly, to show that it's deeply hostile to liberal democracy, wants to abolish it entirely. That Ibram X. Kendi wants some super political, extra political body of experts to police the entire society under the force of law to combat racism, whatever that means. I think I've certainly been encouraged by the support I get from readers and from people who actually show up by taking these positions. And I agree with you. I think a lot of it is so inherently silly and ridiculous that at some point people are going to start giggling. And I wish Americans had more sense of humor in some ways. One reason why I think Orwell said this, one reason why the British never had totalitarianism is if they saw people goose-stepping down the street, they would start giggling. There's a certain level of absurdity to this. So yeah, heighten the contradictions to some extent, but I don't want to be too blithe about this. I think they do have a grip on these institutions, and it's going to take war within those institutions to wrestle their power from them. And they have no qualms about seizing power. They don't believe in anything but power, and therefore they use it ruthlessly. What I want to see, I don't know whether you saw this, you look it up on YouTube, is the Black female conservative minister in the House of Commons under Boris Johnson's government, calling out critical race theory as a repugnant ideology on the front bench, clearly, forthrightly, as something that puts on white people today, for example, undeserved, inherited somehow responsibility for atrocities committed in the ancient past, and also traps minorities in this position of victimhood, which in fact they don't need to be in, and which is psychologically incredibly damaging to them. So I'm going to do all I can in the media and the culture to kind of do this, but more of us should do that. And yes, make fun of them. For God's sake, make fun of them.
Okay, James Lindsay just came out as a Trump voter. You probably saw that, right?
I do. I'm having the week the dish kicked up minutes ago is engaging James on that question.
Andrew, are you there? We have a question from Jennifer Rothschild.
I'm still here.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Jennifer, please.
Thank you. I'm probably farthest to the left of everybody in this group, which doesn't put me terribly far left, but at least further. But I also want to say I love your writing. I've been reading it for years and years and years, and it's fabulous. But I also want to go back to a comment you made earlier. One of the things that I find so fascinating about this conversation is the emphasis on the whole wokeness, basically academic culture among ourselves framing. Climate change, right? Economic transformation, demographic transformation, norms and guardrails of democracy. I mean, those seem to me the big issue. I mean, I hate Trump at least as much as you do, so I'm delighted at everything you've said about him. But in reflecting on this conversation, and more generally the conversation among academics and intellectuals and the people whom we kind of represent, climate change is going to blow up the world, or not. So why aren't we talking about that? I
agree with you entirely. And in my response to James, I'm saying, look, from what I can see, life is going to become uninhabitable for humans and within the foreseeable future, unless we take some dramatic measures. And the idea that this is something we should just forget about or focus on this, there are many issues in an election. I think the damage that Trump has done to the notion of the executive framed in by the rule of law, the damage that he has done to the norms and procedures of liberal democracy, the damage being done to our environment, to the sixth mass extinction in the history of the world. These are incredibly pressing problems. The transformation towards a post-industrial society, the question of whether we need to have a universal basic income. These are these are the core questions that obviously those of us who are obsessed with political theory to some extent are less motivated by. But these are the questions that I'm, if I wanted to, I could get all upset about the Equality Act and vote for Trump. But seriously, if some people have gone overboard on transgender rights so as to explode the category of sex altogether, it's an incredibly foolish and stupid thing to do. But look, whether you're trans or not, the future is going to be unlivable if we let the current trends continue. And Trump's complete indifference to this question, utter indifference even to the epidemic. I mean, there's a level of recklessness here that simply has to be removed.
So why? I mean, again, I speak as a non-conservative, reasonably. Anyway, why don't all the rest of the conservative politicians see this? I mean, what is it? Is this purely electoral incentive, and they'll just say anything to get elected? I mean, that's the easy liberal response. But it seems to me these are smart people who actually care about their country.
Part of what happens and what has happened is the media infrastructure, which has created this entirely siloed propaganda machine on the right and the personality cult of Trump, which has captured the imagination. I think you have to read Eric Hoffer to understand the bond that Trump has with many of his white working class followers. This is an extremely, I think, dangerous element. And the truth is the Republican elites have been absolutely shameful. And, I live in Washington. I had dinner with a senator I won't name last week, who in private is saying so many things that are not, he won't say in public. That everybody in this town on the right knows who Trump is. They're just scared of the bond he has with his base, which is their base. So again, it may be that removing this particular cancer from the system might enable some people to want. And I think my hope is that a really staggering defeat in a week and a half could help embolden some of those people to construct a more constructive conservatism that can engage, particularly the under 40s who are extraordinarily liberal, do not seem to be changing, and for whom capitalism and liberal democracy have failed to give them a really promising future. We have to deal with that. I think that those of us who believe in capitalism have to address the unintended consequences of globalization and the deterioration in the quality of life of many Americans, even if so many poor around the world have benefited dramatically in the last 20 years from the gain in wealth. So yeah, a bigger perspective, absolutely. And talk about another Harvey student. I mean, I've been pretty proud of Bill Kristol for sticking to his guns, especially when you consider how one of his main causes, Israel, the Trump administration has been a fantasy for the Israeli right. I mean, just unexpected bounty constantly, anything they want and more. And yet Bill has consistently said, no, what Trump represents is so foul and so hostile to liberal democratic norms that we have to oppose him as conservatives. And I think if we, who knows, because I think after the election, Trump will probably become a media figure of cult-like proportions who will distort the Republican media ecosystem. But maybe the Murdochs will snap too, and maybe a world without Rush Limbaugh is possible. And not to wish him ill or anything, but so I'm not completely depressed about the right. I think the few people have stood firm. Lots of other people have been quiet, but there's always a tomorrow to engage, and I don't want to slip into sort of Michael Anton reactionary despair. And I don't also want to slip into what James, I think Lindsay has slipped into, which is this Flight 93 kind of paradigm about the election, which is that this is our last chance to save anything like America. It's like, you know, there's always another chance. There's a great, what was it Adam Smith said, there's a great deal of ruin in nations. We have a while to go, and we can champion reform as opposed to radicalism. And I think if Biden overreaches, that may help. I'm not sure whether within 4 years we can get enough of a shift in Republican understanding and values that we need. But I don't think they should go back to neoconservatism. I don't think they should go back to unfettered capitalism. I don't think they should go back to open borders. I think there are things that we've learned. If you look at Britain, and my old college buddy, Boris, they managed, even though they're struggling right now, they managed to use the question of national insecurity, of mass immigration, and of economic insecurity, and of an extreme left, to build an 80-seat majority in the House of Commons, 5-year conservative government, which is essentially a 4th term for the Conservatives in Britain. And Corbyn represents, and should represent to the American left, a cautionary tale. And they didn't nominate a Corbyn, they nominated Biden, just as the Labour Party has finally nominated Keir Starmer as a more center-left person. So there's hope. There's always hope. Even if you don't have much optimism, you can have a little hope.
Thank you. I'm late for another meeting, but
Yeah.
I hope. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Andrew, can you do 2 more questions?
Okay, let me just be quick because people do have to leave, I think.
You do have to leave?
No, I don't.
So there's one from the audience. I'm not sure this person wants to remain anonymous, but it fits with your not wanting to get on the, it's now or never. This is the decisive.
You cut out,
And-
Anna. There you are.
Anna, I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Oh, okay.
Can you do that one more time?
Yes, can you hear me now?
I can.
Okay, so do you think America will not survive, so to speak, a second term of Trump, especially considering how many solidly conservative voters are behind him and how solidly conservative some of his policies are? That's the question.
What does it mean to survive? I do think that America's role in the world will be permanently wounded. I think our liberal democratic traditions will be mortally damaged and probably irrecoverable. But I don't think survival is a question. I think the question is simply the extent of the damage to our culture and our political system that this lunatic will inflict. I think it would be incredibly difficult for the United States to maintain minimal social order and social cohesion in the second term of this president. Even last night, he's using COVID-19 as a way to demonize democratic states as opposed to Republican ones. I mean, this is a person incapable of understanding himself and the role he's supposed to play in our system, a person incapable of calming things down, which is a president's ultimate responsibility, a president who doesn't understand the Constitution in which he plays a part, and a president whose impulse is to inflame, offend, insult, and debase everyone. I think 4 more years of it would be unbelievably destructive to our culture and to our political system, yes. So, but there is a great deal of ruin in the nation. And there's always the possibility of getting through this.
Thank you. And the last question goes to Catherine Hansen or Peter Hansen.
Peter Hansen.
Peter.
Good to see you again. After many years, yes, long time.
You look exactly the same. Screw you.
Look, your energy level is exactly the same, which I commend you for. And I agree with most of what you said. I enjoyed the talk very much. I wonder how will moderate voices generally, but especially politically, how will moderate Democrats arise and at least largely retake the party? The last time there was extremism in the Democratic Party. It kind of took a lot of losing a lot of elections to force a rethinking. It didn't just arise spontaneously because people said, well, you know, we've gone too far into some dubious territory here. Will that have to happen again? How long might that take? Can we, how will we manage as a country?
We'll see. I do think that there will be, if we do get a big Democratic majority in the Senate and House, I do think there will be a lot of people in the Congress who know that their political future will be damaged if the party goes too left, and represent incredibly important parts of the country. They'll also know that that Biden, I think, is almost certainly just a one-term president, and therefore they're going to have to appeal pretty quickly again in a way that wins that same coalition if they want to bring back majority rule. I think if the left comes up with some of its more extreme ideas, such as packing the court, then we might see a big groundswell of moderate Democratic opinion to oppose that. I think it's clear that Biden doesn't really want to do that. I think Biden will, because it's just part of his nature, want to include Republicans and reach out to them. And he wants to prove, I think, that he's better than Obama at dealing with the Congress, because he's been there for so long and has many relationships that Obama simply didn't have. And so I think there's a potential for Biden, especially with a big economic stimulus, with increasing taxes on the wealthy, and with eventual recovery from this epidemic, have a decent chance of building some momentum for his own moderate left position. I'd be a fool to predict it. If you look at, I think of Labour Party, for example, they had 4 incredibly successful terms with Tony Blair. Then they lost, and then they veered left, and they lost twice. They did well in the second election, so that kept them addicted to this. But it's taken not as long as it did in the 80s and 90s for the left to recalibrate and move back to the center in Britain. Because I think they do realize that most normal people, normies as we call them, just are not going to buy Jeremy Corbyn as prime minister, and never were. And God bless them for it. And not only that, but the core working class base of the Labour Party didn't like a party that seemed to regard the international obligations of the United Kingdom to be more important than taking care of them at home. And when they voted to leave the European Union, have that party and the elites ignore their votes. I do think that they may learn the lessons of Corbyn. And I think they may, if Biden wins very convincingly, and you look at the comparison between his win and that of Hillary Clinton, and when you look at the way in which Biden is winning, you know, Hillary Clinton ran a campaign entirely on base turnout. She didn't give a damn about white Catholic voters in the Midwest because she thought she could win with her Obama-style coalition. And they did pretty well. I mean, they won in numbers. So there is an element, I'm not saying that it's not a crazy political strategy, but what Biden has done is turn this into a persuasion election in which he's actually trying to talk to people who voted for Trump to vote for him. And that's gives a different mandate and gives a different feel to an incoming administration. That gives me a little bit of hope. But I'm not going to dismiss your worries and fears. I'm not. And I think some of these left fanatics are really fanatics, and they're not prepared to compromise. And they have captured key instruments of the media and the culture. And that's where we have to start back. Anyway, with that, over to you, Harvey.
Yes, well, we have to stop, but thank you, Andrew. You've been great. So, you know, you mealy-mouthed you are not. And The great thing about you is that there is always something to agree with, and here's a spice in your dish, something to disagree with. All right. Thanks
I
so
like
much.
it that way. I feel that way about myself too. I'd be bored silly otherwise.
Okay. Great to see you.
Lovely to see you, Harvey. Great.
Thank you so much.
Everybody for tuning in and spending this time. I really appreciate it.
Right. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.